The Ghost Army. They had no weapons, no tanks, no artillery, just rubber, paint, and the greatest performance in military history. Imagine you are a German commander in World War II. Your intelligence tells you there is an entire American Army division positioned just across the river. Thousands of soldiers, dozens of tanks, radio communications buzzing with activity. You can hear them. You can almost see them. So you move your forces accordingly and walk straight into a trap. The army you were afraid of never existed. It was built by painters, actors, and sound engineers from New York and Hollywood, and it fooled you completely. The strangest unit in military history. In 1944, the United States Army did something it had never done before, and has never fully admitted to since. It assembled a unit of 1,100 men whose primary qualifications were not marksmanship, physical fitness, or combat experience. They were artists, designers, actors, musicians, sound engineers. Men who, in another life, painted portraits in Greenwich Village, performed on Broadway stages, or recorded jazz records in Harlem studios. They were called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but history remembers them by a different name, the Ghost Army. Their mission was unlike anything ever attempted in warfare. They would travel ahead of real American divisions, set up fake camps, inflate rubber tanks and trucks to full size, broadcast recordings of thousands of soldiers through enormous speakers, and transmit fabricated radio messages, all to convince the Germans that a massive force was positioned exactly where the Allies needed them to look, while the real army moved quietly somewhere else. It was, in the most literal sense, theater, and it worked with a consistency that still astonishes military historians today. How you build a fake army. The logistics of deception at this scale were staggering. The Ghost Army operated across 3 distinct disciplines, and each one required a completely different kind of genius. The first was visual deception. The unit carried inflatable rubber replicas of Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, jeeps, and half-tracks. Each one had to be inflated, positioned, and camouflaged to look exactly right from German reconnaissance aircraft flying overhead. The men who did this were artists, trained to understand light, shadow, proportion, and perspective. They knew instinctively how a tank should sit in mud, how its tracks should leave marks in the earth, how camouflage netting should fall to look natural from 5,000 feet in the air. A painter from the Art Students League of New York turned out to be one of the most effective military deceivers of the entire war. The second was sonic deception. The unit had a dedicated sound team that had recorded hundreds of hours of military audio, tanks moving, soldiers marching, equipment being assembled, trucks rumbling over gravel. They mounted enormous speakers on half-tracks and broadcast these recordings at night across distances of up to 15 miles. German patrols listening in the darkness would hear an entire armored division assembling just beyond the tree line. What they were actually hearing was a recording made on a soundstage in the United States, playing through speakers operated by men who months earlier had been engineering records in Manhattan. The third was radio deception, and this may have been the most sophisticated of all. The Ghost Army had trained radio operators who could perfectly imitate the specific transmission styles of the real units they were impersonating. Every radio operator has a signature, a particular rhythm, a personal touch in how they tap Morse code, called a fist. The Ghost Army's operators spent weeks studying the fists of the men they would replace, until they could fool even experienced German signals intelligence analysts into believing they were listening to the same operator they had been tracking for months.
We were the best-kept secret of the war. We saved thousands of lives, and for 50 years, nobody was allowed to know.
In the field. Between 1944 and 1945, the Ghost Army ran 22 separate deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Germany, and Belgium. They impersonated over 30 different real American units, moving in, setting up the illusion, then disappearing before anyone could look too closely. The danger was constant and underappreciated. These men were not just performers. They were performers operating a few miles from the front lines, often within range of German artillery, with almost no real firepower to defend themselves. If the Germans had discovered what they actually were, a tiny unit of artists with rubber tanks and recording equipment, they could have been overwhelmed in minutes. The deception had to be perfect every single time, because failure meant death, and they operated in plain sight. Part of their strategy was psychological. They would drive through local towns, in jeeps painted with the insignia of the units they were impersonating. Visit local cafes, speak loudly in public places about troop movements, let themselves be seen. They were essentially acting in a play that the Germans were watching from a distance. And the stakes of a bad performance were not a bad review. They were a German armored division, rolling straight through the deception and into the real forces they were meant to protect. Their most critical operation came in March 1945, just weeks before the end of the war. The Ghost Army was tasked with protecting a crossing of the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier between the Allied forces and the heart of Germany. They simulated two entire divisions, roughly 30,000 soldiers, along a stretch of the river to draw German attention away from where the real crossing was happening. The operation worked. The crossing succeeded. Military historians estimate that the Ghost Army's Rhine deception alone may have saved tens of thousands of American lives. The secret that lasted 50 years. When the war ended in 1945, the men of the Ghost Army came home, and then they were told to be quiet about it, permanently. The entire operation was classified by the United States government. These men could not tell their wives, their parents, their children, or their friends what they had done during the war. They had helped win the most important conflict in human history through one of the most audacious deceptions ever conceived, and they came home to silence. So they went back to what they knew. The painters painted. The designers designed. The musicians played. Among the veterans of the Ghost Army were men who went on to become some of the most celebrated artists and designers in American history. Ellsworth Kelly, who became one of the most important abstract painters of the 20th century. Bill Blass, who became one of America's most iconic fashion designers. Arthur Singer, the celebrated wildlife illustrator. These men carried their secret through decades of fame and recognition, never once able to explain where their particular genius for illusion, for making things appear to be what they were not, had been tested and refined. The Ghost Army was declassified in 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended. By then, many of its members had already died, their stories untold. Those who remained were in their 70s and 80s, finally free to speak about what they had done as young men in the fields and forests of Europe. In 2022, the United States Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the country can bestow. It was long overdue. Most of the men who earned it were no longer alive to receive it. There is something deeply strange and deeply human about the Ghost Army, in the middle of the most mechanized, industrialized, brutal conflict in history, a war defined by steel and fire and mass destruction. The thing that turned the tide in dozens of critical moments was imagination, the ability to make someone believe something that wasn't there. We spend a lot of time thinking about war in terms of weapons, generals, and territory. We don't often think about it in terms of artists. But the Ghost Army is proof that the most dangerous weapon a human being can carry isn't a rifle. It's the ability to make you see something that doesn't exist and act on it as though it does. If this story stayed with you, and I think it will, there are many more waiting. Stories that history forgot or chose to ignore. Subscribe, and I'll bring you one every week. And if you know someone who would have stayed until the end of this video, send it to them. That's how these stories survive.